Ch.63, Lost Red Pearl, Inadvertent Eyes Red with Desire for. Lian was curious. Why can't I drink this? The queen reached for the small jaded cup and took it from him, poured a bit of its contents on her handkerchief, and pressed it gently a few times on her face. Mount Taikang recently sent in a batch of fresh fruit. I don't like cherries, but there was a method of making it into paste for facials, so I squeezed some for fun. There's not much use for it and I was about to have it thrown out, so I can't possibly have you drink it. Lian smiled as he listened, but suddenly recalled the events of the day before. There were very few times in a year where Mu King's mother could taste cherries, and Mu King himself would get bullied just for trying to pick some. It was something of a sensitive topic, and Lian was afraid Mu King would be uncomfortable listening to it, so he smiled and changed the subject.
Then do you have anything that I could eat? The queen chuckled.
The way you make it sound, others will think I starve you. But you've been a picky eater ever since you were young, I can't plump you up. You've gotten so thin since you entered the
mountain. Today you'll eat whatever I tell you to, no fuss.
The mother and son conversed for a while, and the queen asked about the incident during the heavenly procession, sounding quite concerned. By the Guoshi's report, it sounds serious. What's going to happen? Will you be punished?
Lian didn't have the chance to answer before Qi Rong cut in.
HMPH. That wasn't cousin Crown Prince's fault. The one who fell off the wall wasn't him. If anyone must be punished, then it should be that little fiend. What little fiend? Lian thought in annoyance.
He hadn't corrected Qi Rong, but the queen laughed.
Just then, she noticed the two outside the manor. Who's the child next to Feng Xin? It's the first time I've seen another person by your side.
Lian replied cheerfully, that's Mu King.
He was the one who played the ghost on stage yesterday. Hearing this, Qi Rong slightly raised his brows. The queen said, really? Have him come in so I can see his face. Feng Xin can come in too. Thus, Feng Xin and Mu King entered the chamber and knelt before the queen. She took her time looking over Mu King and said to Lian, I thought he fought rather well yesterday, a good courteous child. Looking at his face you'd think he'd be a gentle minister, but who knew he could be that tenacious using a saber? Lian grinned. Right. I think he's really good too. Qi Rong on the other hand, commented coolly, oh. The ghost from yesterday was him.
Lian heard his tone and felt dread.
Sure enough, the next second, Qi Rong suddenly exploded. Snatched that small jaded cup from the little tea table, and swung it at Mu King's head. Here. Your reward. Fortunately, Lian was faster, and smacked Qi Rong's hand, forcing him to drop the cup so the splash didn't make it to Mu King's face. Lian pulled him back by the collar. Qi Rong, what are you doing? Exclamation mark. Even whilst being held, Qi Rong was still rampant and raging. Cousin, I'm helping you discipline an impudent servant. Before you made it yesterday, he sure was enjoying himself, taking in all the limelight. Who the fuck do you think you are? The star of the heavenly procession.
Gonna overthrow the heavens.
2.
Exclamation mark.
Exclamation mark. The queen was stunned. Wrong, what are you doing? Mu King's face was spared the splash, but his clothes hadn't been because the queen hadn't given word. He remained kneeling on the floor, his face grim and pale. Si Lian passed Qi Rong to Feng Xin. Don't let him hit anyone.
Feng Xin only used one hand to restrain Qi Rong, but Qi Rong was kicking and punching, spitting as he
shouted. And who the fuck do you think you are to have the fucking nerve to touch me so casually? Si Lian could feel his head aching.
Qi Rong, you're getting more and more out of control.
Then he turned to the queen.
Mother, I forgot to mention something.
Please take away his golden carriage.
Qi Rong was shocked and yelled, No.
No. Why?
That's Auntie's birthday gift to me. Even if it is, it must be confiscated, Si Lian said.
We almost ran into trouble on the streets. Best not to touch it again until you learn how to drive properly. The queen ed and asked, Trouble?
What trouble?
Si Lian retold to her the crazy saga of Qi Rong's driving. Qi Rong was furious, his eyes red around the rim. Cousin Crown Prince is wrong. I didn't run into a single person. Si Lian snorted. That's because someone stopped you. Qi Rong struggled out of Si Lian's hands and ran out of Qifeng Manor in a mad fit, not turning back even when the queen called out to him. She said sadly, I'll talk to him tomorrow about confiscating his carriage.
Sigh, that child had wanted a coach for the longest time, so when his birthday came around, I saw that he was still desperately wanting one, so I gifted it to him. Who knew it'd turn out like this? Had I known, I wouldn't have given it to him. Why must he have a carriage?
Si Lian wondered. He said it's so he could go to Mount Taikang anytime to bring you home, the queen replied. Si Lian fell silent, learning that at the end of the day, it was a gesture of goodwill. After a moment, he spoke. It's better instead to find him a good teacher, and restrain that temper.
He can't keep going on
like this. The queen sighed. And what teacher can restrain him? He only ever listens to you.
We could hardly have him enter the mountain to go cultivate with you. Besides, the Guoshi would die before taking him in as a
disciple. Si Lian found the idea both hilarious and horrifying and shook his head. With a temper like that, if he should enter the royal holy pavilion, he would raise hell for sure.
Both the mother and the son were deeply troubled by this, and couldn't think of any ideas, and so they let it go for the time being. That evening, after having seen his parents and caught up, Si Lian rose to leave
the palace. Everyone knew that the crown prince was deeply obsessed with cultivation, and ever since he entered the royal holy pavilion, he visited his parents less and less. The king didn't say much on the matter, but the queen was always reluctant to see him go.
After leaving the palace, Si Lian casually strolled around the
royal capital, and accompanied Mu King to make a visit to his home, as suggested the day before. The opulent tall red gates and the impoverished slums were a street away from each other. Mu King's home was situated in a dark alley of the most bustling area of the royal capital. The three of them had just turned into the alley when 5 or 6 children in rags surrounded them, calling out, Gege.
Gege is back.
Si Lian was confused at first, wondering why they would call strangers Gege, but then he discovered
that the Gege they were calling wasn't him, but Mu King.
The children called out to him sweetly, but Mu King ignored them.
There's nothing this time.
Don't call me anything. His face was wooden, but his voice wasn't cold. He turned to see Lian. "Don't mind them, Your Highness, they're just kids from the block."
However, that group of children was obviously very comfortable around him, having grown up playing together, and they weren't afraid of him at all.
They giggled and surrounded them, the dirty little hands
extended, begging for munchies from Mew King.
Finally, Mew King reached for the gem-like cherries in his bag and handed them out. Feng Xin was astonished seeing this, as if Mew King doing anything of the sort was a miracle. After all, Mew King had a pretty boy face that looked extremely selfish and cold-hearted, the type that, despite seeing someone die from starvation on the streets, would still keep a tight hold on his own food. Si Lian, on the other hand, wasn't surprised at all. At first he had also wanted to find something to give to the children, but he didn't usually carry sweets on his person, and having Feng Xin give coins was too much like dismissing beggars that Si Lian didn't think it appropriate. Suddenly, there was a boom of galloping noise coming from the main streets, the long, shrieking whinny of a horse, and people screaming. The three of them stopped, then Si Lian rushed out of the alley. All around the main street was chaos.
Stalls toppled and people on the ground. The pedestrians were all running to get away, apples and pears
rolled all over. He hadn't figured out what was happening when he heard the crazed laughter of a young
man. "Out of my way, get out of my way.
I don't give a shit if any of you get trampled." Feng Xin swore.
"It's Qi-Rong again." Sure enough, Qi-Rong stood atop that glamorous golden coach, his expression malicious, lashing his
whip wildly, the white horse howling from the welting.
"Stop him!"
Si Lian shouted. That golden carriage whooshed by them, and Feng Xin acknowledged, understood, and charged on ahead. Si Lian was about to go check for any wounded from all the toppled stalls and knocked over
pedestrians left behind Qi-Rong's mad trail, when suddenly he noticed something wrong. He whipped his
head around, and saw that just behind that large golden coach, something was being dragged along with
a thick, long hemp rope.
At the end of the rope was a gunny sack, and in that sack there seemed to be
something struggling.
It looked like there was a person in that sack. That moment, Si Lian could only feel his blood run cold. The next second, he rushed forward. From all the whipping, that white horse was dashing like it was running for its life, spinning the wheels of that carriage furiously.
Feng Xin went to hold the horse back, but probably wouldn't be able to stop it.
Immediately,
Si Lian raced up to the carriage in only a few steps, unsheathed his sword, and struck down.
That rope snapped in two, and the gunny sack dropped to the ground, rolled, and came to a stop.
Si Lian bent forward to inspect it.
That gunny sack had been dragged for who knows how long and was ripped from all the scraping. It was extremely dirty, covered in blood, looking like a dead body bag. Another swing from his sword, and the rope tied around the opening was cut.
He opened the bag and
looked, and there was indeed someone inside. What's more, it was a young child. Si Lian ripped open that entire sack. The young child within was curled into a ball, hugging his head tightly. His filthy clothes were covered either in giant footprints or fresh blood. Even his hair was tangled with blood. He was a mess, and it was obvious he had been heavily beaten by someone, so much so that he
didn't even look human anymore. Judging by his size, He was only 7 or 8, a very small creature, shaking as if a layer of his skin had been forcibly peeled off. Truly incredible that he was still alive after
such a violent beating. Lian reached out a hand to feel his neck, and found that his pulse wasn't too weak, and sighed a breath of relief. He immediately picked up the small body, turned around and yelled, enraged, Feng
Sin.
Arrest Qi Rong! Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark.
He could not believe that something like this could happen in the kingdom of Xianlei.
Under the light of day, on the main street, a member of the nobility stuffed a live human in a gunny sack to be dragged behind a horse carriage. If he hadn't seen and stopped it, this small child would have been dragged to death that day.
Some distance away came the sounds of whinnying and the angry roars of Qi Rong, and soon after, Feng
Sin yelled back, he's been stopped.
Lian rushed towards them just in time to hear Qi Rong howl in rage.
You fucking lowly servant dare hurt me!
WHO gave you the balls! Exclamation mark.
Exclamation mark. Turns out, Feng Sin couldn't stop him, so he tried to snatch the reins from him instead. Of course Qi Rong wouldn't let him, so the two pulled back and forth, and in a moment of carelessness Feng Sin bumped and pushed him off the carriage. He fell to the ground and rolled a few times, his knees scraped.
Seeing that
he was surrounded by bystanders, he felt nothing but rage and embarrassment. However, Lian cut in. I did.
Qi Rong opened and closed his mouth a couple times before finally crying, Cousin Crown Prince.
Lian said angrily, look at what you've done. Qi Rong, I really. Just then, he suddenly felt the child in his arms twitch, seemingly to have loosened the hands hugging his head, and was peeking at him from the gap between his elbows. Lian immediately restrained his anger, and lowered his head to soothe him in a gentle voice. How do you feel?
Do you feel pain anywhere especially?
That child was amazingly still conscious, not fainted from pain, not frozen in shock, and shook his head. Lian saw that half of his bloody little face poked out and was about to check for other head injuries. But that child firmly covered the other half of his face with his hands, stubbornly refusing to show him.
Next chapter.
Ch.64, Lost Red Pearl, Inadvertent Eyes Red with Desire 5.
Lian soothed, don't be afraid, I'm not going to do anything.
I only want to check your injuries. That child, however, pressed his hands harder, revealing only one large obsidian eye, looking panicked. But this panic didn't seem like he was afraid he would get beaten, but rather that something would be discovered. Looking at this little face half covered with only an eye, Lian suddenly thought he might have seen this child somewhere, and squinted his eyes.
Qi Rong saw his upset face and explained, Cousin Crown Prince, that little fiend ruined your grand ceremony yesterday, so I avenged you.
Don't worry, I was careful, he won't die. Sure enough, the child held in his arms was the one who fell from the city wall during the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession the day before. No wonder Lian thought he looked familiar. This little child hadn't even changed, he was still wearing the same outfit as the day before, but because of all the beating and dragging, he was filthier and looked nothing like he had before, not even like he was the same person. Lian couldn't hold back his anger anymore. WHO told you to avenge me. It has nothing to do with this child, it wasn't his fault.
Qi Rong justified himself. Of course it's his fault.
If not for him, you wouldn't have gotten scolded by the
Guoshi. This ruckus was growing out of hand, and the crowd watching was becoming bigger, all whispering to
each other. Just then, Mu King approached too, and Qi Rong pointed his whip at him, his expression laced
with hostility. And you
lowly servant.
Just by the looks of him I can tell he doesn't know his place. If you don't
discipline him, sooner or later he's going to overthrow and step on you, the master.
I helped you discipline him, but you turned around and defended him instead, and told on me too.
Now uncle and auntie not only disregarded my goodwill, they even confiscated my golden carriage. Cousin, that was my birthday gift. I've wanted it for over 2 years. Exclamation mark. Mu King gave Qi Rong an unreadable sweeping look. Si Lian puffed a laugh from rage. I don't need your goodwill, not like this. Are you really avenging me? Or are you avenging yourself? Qi Rong said.
Cousin, why would you say that to me?
And what have I done wrong in following after you? Si Lian couldn't argue with him. Qi Rong, listen here.
From now on, you're not allowed to touch this child.
Not even a finger. Do you hear me? Exclamation mark.
Just then, Si Lian suddenly felt a pull on his neck.
He was just at the height of his fury and was startled. He looked down and saw that young child had buried his face in his chest, his 2 hands tightly encircled
around Si Lian's neck. Si Lian felt him shake uncontrollably and thought he was hurting.
He asked hurriedly, what's wrong?
That young child was covered all over in mud, grime, and blood, filthy and unkempt, and it all smeared
onto Si Lian's white robe, but Si Lian didn't mind it at all.
He gently patted the child's back to comfort him and said in a gentle voice, I'll go take you to the doctors right now.
That child didn't respond, but he hugged Si Lian even tighter. He was tense and wouldn't let go, as if he was holding on to a lifeline. Qi Rong saw that Si Lian wouldn't acknowledge his goodwill, his heart solely
on outsiders, then saw that kid had sullied Si Lian's robes with that bloody, muddy shit, and his anger flared.
He raised the whip, and was about to lash the back of that child's head.
Feng Xin was standing on
the side, and in a split second, his leg flew out and kicked Qi Rong right on the arm. There was a loud crack and Qi Rong screamed, the whip fell to the ground, and his right arm dropped
limply at an abnormal angle.
He was frozen in disbelief, and it was a while before he slowly raised his head, glaring at Feng Xin, enunciating each word. You dare break my arm. The words were extremely cold. It was only until after he kicked that Feng Xin realized what he had done.
And his face changed, but Mu King's face changed more. It was no matter how much they detested Qi Rong behind his back, that was one thing.
But as a personal guard, to have transgressed and accidentally broken the arm of royalty, that was something completely different. Just then, Si Lian had had his hands full with that child, and behind him was packed with onlookers, so he couldn't dodge, but if he had dodged, it would have been a piece of cake. Only, Qi Rong came at him with
such aggression and so out of the blue. Feng Xin moved too fast without thinking, and Si Lian didn't have
the chance to stop him. Now everything was in even more of an uproar, and Si Lian didn't have time to think. His clothes were getting soaked in blood. If they delayed any longer, the child might just die right There. Si Lian made a split-second decision, inhaled deeply, and shouted in a clear voice, "Everyone, if
anyone was pulled into this incident today, please record any damages and loss. I will take all responsibility without fail."
Then, he turned to Feng Xin and Mu King.
Save the child first.
Take Qi Rong away, and don't let him continue havoc outside. Finishing his instructions, Si Lian ran towards the palace with the child in his arms. Feng Xin received
the command, his expression back to normal, and picked up the raging Qi Rong before following after Si Lian.
The soldiers guarding the palace gates thought it was strange to see the crown prince racing back, having only left but a short while ago, but naturally they wouldn't stop him. Thus, Si Lian ran straight to the medical pavilion and entered the infirmary, leaving Feng Xin and Mu King outside the door with Qi Rong under arrest. The crown prince rarely returned to the palace and rarely made demands, so the imperial doctors naturally rushed over speedily. Si Lian placed that young child in a chair and said, "Thanks in advance, everyone."
This child was beaten
by a number of adults, got stuffed into a gunny sack, and dragged on the roads. Please check for me if there are any head injuries first, that's the most important thing. The imperial medical team had never seen a royal or a noble bring a dirty wild babe for them to heal before, but they also knew they needed to do whatever they were told to, and they all acknowledged Si Lian's direction. One of them spoke, "Put your hands down first, little kid." However, although that young child was docile in Si Lian's arms the whole time, he started struggling.
Then and firmly covered the right side of his face, refusing to let go no matter what. No matter how skilled
the imperial doctors were, if the patient didn't cooperate there wasn't anything they could do. The doctors looked to Si Lian. "Your Highness, how?"
Si Lian raised a hand.
"He's probably afraid of strangers."
"Don't worry, let me."
That child was sitting in a chair and Si Lian couldn't meet his eyes, so he bent forward and inclined his
head.
"What's your name?" The large eye of that child stared at him intently, his obsidian black pupil reflected a snow-white silhouette. This gaze, if it must be described, was exactly like Feng Xin had said, possessed by the devil, and shouldn't be the gaze of a child.
It was for a moment before the child lowered his head. "Hom, 5.
His voice was tiny and soft, mumbled, as if he didn't want to say it, as if he was a little embarrassed. Si Lian only sort of heard the word Hong, and asked again. "How old are you?" 10, that child replied. Si Lian was only asking off-handedly, hoping to lower his guard, but hearing that he responded with 10, he was startled.
I thought he was only 7 or 8, but he's 10.
This child is truly weak and emaciated.
After a pause, Si Lian smiled softly.
The doctors will see to your wounds now, don't be afraid and lower
your hands, okay?
That child heard, but hesitantly shook his head.
Why not?
Si Lian asked. He was silent for a while before replying, "Ugly." His response was just the one word, and no matter how Si Lian soothed, he refused to remove his hands. Si Lian promised that he wouldn't think him ugly, that he wouldn't look, turning around wouldn't do either. Such a young age, but such obstinance. Without much choice, the imperial doctors could only ask him a few questions, have him recognize a number of fingers, make sure he didn't feel faint or have any Headaches, make sure he understood what he saw and what he thought, then tend to his physical wounds.
As the imperial doctors worked, they became more and more awed. Si Lian guarded on the side, and
hearing their sounds of wonder, he asked, "How is he, everyone?" One of the imperial doctors couldn't help but ask, "Your Highness, did this little kid really get beaten and dragged on the roads in a gunny sack?" Si Lian was speechless. Why should that be false? The imperial doctor replied, "If that really was the case, then, amazing. I have never seen anyone so tenacious.
He has 5 broken ribs and a broken leg, a number of injuries big and small. Even with all of
that added together, he remains conscious and converses while sitting up. Even adults would find this difficult to do, never mind a 10-year-old child." Hearing how severe the injuries were, Si Lian became even more furious at Qi Rong. He looked at that child and saw that he was sitting there on that chair as if he felt no pain, and was peeking at him with that large black left eye. When he noticed he was caught staring by Si Lian, he immediately turned his head away. 5 Hong is the word for red. Next chapter.
Ch.65, Lost Red Pearl, Inadvertent Eyes Red with Desire 6.
Seeing this, for some reason Si Lian thought he was both silly and pitiful, then turned to ask, "Will his injuries all heal?" One of the imperial doctors wrapped new layers of bandages around the child's head and replied, "Not a problem."
Si Lian finally felt relieved and nodded.
"Thank you for all your hard work."
Just then, an attendant entered to notify them of the imminent arrival of His Majesty the King and Queen. Each of the imperial doctors immediately stood up and exited the infirmary to greet them.
Si Lian moved the child to the bed and said, "Lie down for a bit and rest." He then thought the child was afraid of strangers, and so many people crowding in might scare him, so Si Lian lowered the bedside curtains before rising to his feet too. A number of guards and attendants surrounded the king and the queen as they walked into the pavilion. The queen's face was pale. "My dear child, why did you return all of a sudden after having just left the palace?
Were you hurt
outside?" "Mother, please be at ease," Si Lian said. "I wasn't hurt, it was someone else who was wounded." Just then, Qi Rong called out from the corner, "Auntie, save me." Only then did the queen notice Qi Rong on the side, firmly held by Feng Xin and arrested, and she was shocked. She was only worried about the well-being of her son, and completely ignored everything else. But now that she saw, she asked, "Rong, what's happened?"
The king, on the other hand, slightly knitted his brows.
"Feng Xin, why are you holding Prince Xiao Jing like a criminal?" When His Majesty arrived, Feng Xin should have bowed in greeting like Mu King and all the others, but
because he had Qi Rong in hand, he couldn't let go, and thus entered into an awkward situation.
Si Lian spoke up.
"It was under my command."
Qi Rong held up his right arm.
"Auntie, my arm is broken."
The queen hadn't had the chance to sympathize before Si Lian cut in harshly. "You broke an arm, but what about that child?" "What child?" the king asked. "A 10-year-old child," Si Lian answered. "Powerless, vulnerable, and already weak. Qi Rong sent his lackeys to beat him. If not for his tenacity, he would have been beaten to death on the spot." Qi Rong looked as if he just heard a joke, his eyes widening.
"A powerless, Vulnerable 10-year-old child.
Weak. Cousin, you don't know just how vicious, how savage, how spunky that little fiend was, he only
pretends to be pathetic in front of you.
I called for 5 or 6 guys and they still couldn't catch the brat. He thrashed and bit them until they were bloodied all over. If he didn't anger me, why would I have dragged him behind the horse carriage? Hearing this, both the king and the queen's faces dropped.
Si Lian took in a deep breath and shouted,
Enough. Do you think what you've done is impressive? Qi Rong wasn't one to shy away from showing his face. He was so arrogant and ostentatious that there was no reason the citizens of the capital did not see him.
And after they had seen, there was no reason he
wouldn't become the talk of the city as after meal leisure.
The king gave the queen a look, his expression slightly blue.
Take Prince Xiao Jing away. Doctor, see to
his arm.
The golden carriage will be permanently confiscated.
You are to be detained and reflect on your actions for a month without release.
The guard behind him immediately acknowledged the order and moved forward to take Qi Rong. Only
then did Feng Xin let go.
Qi Rong no longer cared and HMPHED. Take it, take it.
I already knew today would have been the last chance to drive it.
Hearing that he possessed no repenting heart, the queen sighed sadly. Si Lian spoke up. Looks like with only a month of detention to reflect, he will still do this again next time.
There needs to be stricter discipline.
Qi Rong was taken aback and stammered angrily, Cousin Crown Prince, you. But the next moment he switched gears. Fine. Then I admit, this time it was my fault. No matter how His Majesty punishes me, Qi Rong has no complaints. His next words changed the subject's direction. However, shouldn't Cousin Crown Prince's servant also be punished? Uncle, Auntie, my arm was broken by that Feng Xin.
Hearing this, the king instantly moved his gaze to Feng Xin, looking outraged. Feng Xin lowered his head.
And new king inconspicuously moved 2 steps away. The king said coldly, Feng Xin, you are the crown prince's bodyguard. The crown prince treats you well.
And regards you highly, but have you forgotten your own place?
What is this arrogance? Exclamation mark.
Your duty is to
serve His Highness. Is this how you serve him? You dare raise a hand against the crown prince's cousin,
Prince Xiao Jing. Hearing his words, Feng Xin was ready to kneel, but Si Lian stopped him.
Don't kneel.
Feng Xin obeyed Si Lian's commands first and foremost. Even under the king's orders, his priority was
His Highness, and so he instantly straightened again.
Seeing this, the king became even more upset.
It's true Feng Xin broke Qi Rong's arm, but the reason was to protect the master, Si Lian said. Besides, Qi Rong was at fault first, not Feng Xin, so why must he kneel? It doesn't matter why, the king said. Either way, he has offended Prince Xiao Jing. There's a difference between masters and servants, a distinction of superior and inferior.
Never mind if I, the king, was to make him kneel. If I were to punish him with 100 lashings, there wouldn't be anything inappropriate
about it. Although the king wasn't as affectionate towards Qi Rong as the queen was, Qi Rong was still
nevertheless of the royal household, never to be disobeyed or offended.
Qi Rong knew this very well, and said with a sidelong glance, no need for a lashing punishment. He Belongs to cousin Crown Prince, I don't want to make things awkward.
As long as he breaks his own arm.
And kneels to kowtow before me 3 times, I can let this go. The king nodded slowly, looking to consent on the decision. However, Si Lian spoke up. If you must punish Feng Xin, then you must punish me first. He's my servant, first of all, he's done nothing wrong, and second of all, if he was at fault, it was still done under my orders, so I will take punishment on his behalf.
Hearing him say this, the king became outraged once more.
All fathers and sons in the world must go through this change. When the son was young, they would all idolize their fathers as the greatest hero on earth, their own personal role model, their worship apparent.
However, when the son matured to a certain age, they would start to question everything the father did.
Even brew revulsion, until, in the end, neither side would acknowledge each other.
To enter Mount Taikang for training, Si Lian's fundamental objective was to improve his martial arts and
search for the direction of his heart.
However, he never cared for where he trained, nor with what identity.
The word Dao, 6 inches for cultivation, meant exactly as it appeared, which was to walk the path. As long as
one's heart was set on the path with one mind, then training could be done anywhere. He didn't need to follow any dictated norms, nor enter the royal holy pavilion.
But there was another reason why Si Lian had begged to train on Mount Taikang, and that was because he felt he didn't really get along with his father. As the Honorable Crown Prince of Xianlei, the moment Si Lian was born, the King of Xianlei had already drawn out every detail of the path of his life. It was all right when he was still young. A child had few worries, and Si Lian only needed his parents to build gold foil palaces with him, to play around and laugh.
As the years went by, Si Lian felt more and more that his father wasn't only a father, but also the
ruler of a kingdom, and many of their thoughts and actions could no longer concur. For example, the so-called royal prestige was one of the things Si Lian hated. If they couldn't agree, then it was best to stay far away. Every time he returned to the palace, he spent more time conversing with his mother, and never had any heart-to-hearts with his father. The two never took the initiative to talk to each other, either, and it was also the queen who always mediated between
them. The father and son had maintained this frozen relationship for many months, and now, with Si Lian stubbornly refusing to back down, the king said, "Very well.
Take his place, if you must. Let's see if you
can actually withstand it."
Of course I can. Si Lian retaliated. The queen saw the two of them were butting heads again and anxiously said, "Why must it be like this?" Just then, Feng Xin, who hadn't spoken a word, suddenly raised his left arm and struck down on his right. There was a loud crack, the crowd was startled and looked to the sound, and saw his right arm was
dropped limply, exactly like Qi Rong's.
Si Lian was both shocked and furious. Feng Xin. Cold sweat rolled down Feng Xin's forehead, and without a word, he knelt down before Qi Rong and kowtowed 3 times.
Qi Rong was feeling rather proud and laughed out loud.
"All right, I guess I'll forgive you.
Why couldn't you have done this earlier?"
Even though his arm was broken, too, when he left he looked energized and refreshed, as if he had fought a winning battle. As for Feng Xin, he was still kneeling on the ground, and Mu King stood on the sidelines, watching, his expression gloomy, but his thoughts unreadable. Si Lian whipped around to face his father, yelling angrily, "You!" Quote. Feng Xin grabbed him with his left arm. "Your Highness." The queen also put her hands on him to pull him back. Si Lian knew that Feng Xin had followed him
since the age of 14, and was cared for deeply by the queen. He only did this because he couldn't
bear to see the queen sad over the dispute between father and son.
If Si Lian threw a fit now, then Feng Xin's efforts would go to waste, so he swallowed his outrage, but the fire continued to burn inside his heart.
The king finally looked appeased, and left with a grim expression. The queen had always liked Feng Xin.
She sighed. "My child, we've wronged you. Please don't say that, Your Majesty."
"This was my duty," Feng Xin replied. Hearing this, Mu King's eyes squinted, like he'd snorted coldly. Si Lian, however, closed his eyes. "Mother, if you really can't handle Qi Rong, then lock him up."
The queen sighed, nodded, then shook her head, then left too. Si Lian asked for one of the imperial doctors to tend to Feng Xin's right arm, and apologized.
"Feng Xin. I'm sorry."
Once the crowds had cleared, Feng Xin immediately changed face and clicked his tongue.
"This is nothing. I dared hit him, so how could I be scared of his revenge?" After a pause, he advised, "Your Highness, of course it's right for you to discipline Qi Rong, but don't be resentful of His Majesty.
His Majesty is the
king, and a figurehead of the older generation, so he thinks differently than we do. Seeing the two of you
fight makes the queen sad. She has her difficulties too. And how could Si Lian not know his mother's difficulties? The mother of Qi Rong was the younger blood sister of the queen, and they got along very well.
When she was young and immature, at the first bloom of romance, she thirsted for freedom, listened to words of honey and broke off a good engagement to elope with a bodyguard in the palace, who knew that the one she had chosen was villainous.
One who was born of nobility was stuffed into a doghouse-like shack, and after only half a year, the villain revealed his true nature, drunken and violent.
After Qi Rong was born, he
became even more abusive. Finally, the mother couldn't take it anymore, and when Qi Rong turned 5,
she took him and ran away from home. Because she had become a royal scandal, she closed the door and
no longer stepped foot outside. She spent the rest of her life in grim depression, only showing particular
love and devotion to her only son. During an upheaval, Qi Rong's mother lost her life saving the queen, and before she passed, she asked Si Lian's mother to look after Qi Rong. Of course, the queen did her utmost. However, it was still awkward raising someone else's son.
Discipline was difficult. Too strict, and it'd appear to be abuse. Thinking of past love and friendships, she could hardly be so harsh.
Too lax, and it'd turn out to become the behavior seen today, and without stricter restraints. It could only get worse in the future. The queen also wondered often. She raised Si Lian and Qi Rong almost the same, so why were their characters so different?
Just then, Si Lian suddenly remembered there was a small child still lying on the bed here in the infirmary.
He raised the bedside curtain to check, and that child was sitting up, looking like he was trying
to peek out of some crack to watch.
The moment Si Lian raised the curtain, he laid down obediently. Si Lian said, "Did we scare you with the fight just now? Don't let it bother you, it has nothing to do with you. Your Highness, this little kid's wounds have been tended to." Now he only needs quiet rest, one of the imperial doctors said.
Si Lian dipped his head slightly.
Thank you for your hard work.
He then bent down again to ask, where do you live? I'll take you home.
That child shook his head. No home.
Feng Xin approached, holding the arm that was now in a sling.
No home.
So he really is a little beggar.
Seeing that this child was emaciated and small, his clothes filthy and unkempt, it wasn't impossible. If he had no home to return to, they couldn't possibly leave him at the palace or throw him out on the streets. Si Lian pondered a moment, then said, if that's the case, then let's bring him with us back to Mount
Taikang.
Unexpectedly, Mu King suddenly spoke up. He's lying.
6 Dao. Dao in this context is translated to cultivation, but the word originally means the path, used to indicate both the literal and philosophical.
Thus, one who practices the path is a Taoist cultivator.
2.
Learn more, simply Google Taoism.